commander-in-chief that presidents often make their most difficult decisions. They are obliged to protect the free world with violence if necessary, but must be wary. Their choices may save lives or result in mass death and violence. Historically, the commander-in-chief has exercised power to send the United States military into hostile situations without the approval of Congress, which reserves the constitutional right, actually, to declare war officially. It has always worried many that the president may have too much power in this respect, giving rise to the 1973 War Powers Act, which placed a 60-day limit on the amount of time the U.S. military could be in a hostile situation without the approval of Congress. This really reeled in the president's power as commander-in-chief of the armies. President Bush found himself at a crossroads, however, when he became president. Crossroads of difficult decisions. He is often criticized for excessive use of military force because he launched a massive military operation in response to the 2001 terrorist attacks on the World Trade Center. After the attacks, Congress passed the first legislation limiting or extending the president's power over the armed forces since the War Powers Act, a joint resolution known as the Authorization for Use of Military Force Against Terrorists. This allowed Bush the use of necessary and proper force against those who may have planned, authorized, committed, or aided in the attacks, giving him unprecedented imperial power as commander-in-chief. 2 years after the attacks, already in pursuit of the perpetrators of the 9/11 attacks, Bush agreed to lead an invasion of Iraq with British Prime Minister Tony Blair. This was not without the support of Congress, however, as they had passed the Iraq War Resolution in 2002 approving of the proposed conflict. But during the war, Bush was very involved with each of the fronts of the conflict, keeping very close contact and influence over the theater commanders, so it can be said that he was very imperialist in this regard. With his extra imperialist power during his presidency, he succeeded in assisting with the toppling of the regime of Saddam Hussein, but found no weapons of mass destruction as it had been predicted he would. Whether or not it was worth giving such great power to the commander-in-chief during this time is still much in debate.
Oh, hi. Didn't see you there. I'm going to tell you about the President as Chief Legislator. As Chief Legislator, the President influences lawmaking from the executive branch. It is explicitly written in Article 2 of the Constitution that once a bill is passed, the President has 10 days to either veto or the bill or sign it into law. If he does neither, after 10 days the bill becomes a law. His veto powers are not absolute, however. If Congress votes in 2/3 favor to overturn a veto, the bill will become a law. This limits his legislative power. The President also is granted the power and responsibility to give a State of the Union to Congress where he addresses his legislative agenda. The President's power lies in how he gives a State of the Union. Presidents give huge speeches attended by all of Congress and with all the American people watching.
Madam Speaker, the President of the United States!
He uses this occasion to appeal to not only Congress but the whole country. The President himself can write and propose his own legislation too. Though he cannot formally introduce it as a bill, the President can also influence lawmaking in a host of ways not explicitly written in the Constitution. He can bargain with legislators, trading for and conceding political favors, or bypass legislators and appeal to party leaders or special interest groups. If a piece of legislation is especially important, a president may also hit the road and campaign to a certain congressperson's constituents. For instance, George W. Bush wanted to pass lower tax cuts that would lower income taxes to between 10 and 33%. He gave speeches to Hispanic business leaders and made the Bush tax cuts one of the keystones of his presidential campaign.
And therefore, raising any income taxes will cause there to be less capital available for small businesses, which will make it harder to create jobs.
He also pressured Congress that it would be a sign of good faith to sign the bill. After Tyler's campaigning and appealing to different groups, he got the tax cuts passed. Another marquee piece of legislation that he passed was the No Child Left Behind Act. 3 days into his presidency, Bush announced the education reform. The reform required public schools to give standardized tests to make sure students had adequate reading and math skills and allocated funding based on those test scores.
Many states transitioning to higher standards, and that's going to take some time to get there, but there's a huge amount of interest and momentum behind that.
Though a controversial bill, it was passed with bipartisan support and signed into law by Bush. As head of the executive branch, one of Bush's most tangible accomplishments was getting No Child Left Behind passed. The framers meant for the president to be a check on Congress's legislative abilities. So as chief legislator, the president has few formal checks. President Bush used his influence and unchecked legislative power to help pass multiple bills.
Excuse me, ma'am, just a second. Can we just get a second to film? Chief Diplomat, please. We know you know a lot about the issue. Please, can we just get a second?
The President has the responsibility of negotiating treaties, nominating a foreign policy team, including ambassadors, and receiving ambassadors from other countries. Although it is not stated in the Constitution, the President is also responsible for maintaining alliances, forming coalitions, making executive agreements, and facilitating peaceful negotiations. George Bush has used his formal and informal powers in many foreign affairs. In 2002, Bush terminated the anti-ballistic missile treaty we had with Russia. This treaty was made to limit strategic defense systems and keep a balance of power. It turned out to be an excuse for each country to advance their weaponry. Bush was criticized for not seeking congressional input before performing this action. Although the President has to have 2/3 of the Senate ratify a treaty, there is no check on the President for withdrawing from a treaty. After Bush withdrew from the anti-ballistic missile treaty, he signed another one called the Strategic Offensive Reductions Committee, also called the Treaty of Moscow. It tried to reduce the amount of strategic arms. The treaty was ratified by at least 2/3 of the Senate and came into effect in June 2003. As an informal power, it is important that the President maintain alliances. During George Bush's presidency, the U.S.'s relations with India grew significantly. In September 2001, Bush removed sanctions on India that were imposed in 1998 after India tested a nuclear weapon.
The relationship between our two nations is strong, and it rests on a firm foundation. We share common interests, rooted in common belief that freedom can change lives and transform nations. Today, our two democracies have formed a strategic partnership.
Bush also improved relations with other Asian countries when he attended the Association of Southeast Asian Nations Conference in 2007 for the first time. After the 2003 invasion of Iraq, relations were strained with Germany and France, who opposed the invasion. However, Bush maintained a strong relationship with the Prime Minister of Britain, Tony Blair, which helped the U.S. in both the war in Iraq and in Afghanistan. George Bush made it a goal for his second term to improve strained relationships with these countries. Yes, he is an imperial president.
The executive branch is one of the three keystone aspects of our government. Within this branch, the president rules. When he comes into office, he chooses whether he wants the branch organized in a pyramid, circle, or ad hoc method. These different methods all have their pros and cons. The executive office is also split into different groups to deal with different information. One of the largest is the Office of Management and Budget, but there's also the well-known CIA and lesser-known Council of Economic Affairs. The President appoints leaders for these positions and runs the executive branch from the top. George Bush served in this role from 2000 until 2008 and used a broad swath of both formal and informal powers. He has the unwritten, but often used, power of declaring executive orders. With these, he can specifically tell employees of the branch what to do and how to do it. One of the most controversial uses of the power was when Bush ordered the NSA to use wiretapping to find terrorists. This was done without a warrant, something that would normally be very illegal, but was passed as within the presidential rights due to the country's current responses to terrorism and the loose language of Article 2 in the Constitution. Critics argued that it was being used to silence outspoken individuals who argued against Bush's handling of issues. Both the fact that the Congress can nullify it and that the next president can undo it serve as checks on Bush's decisions. However, the Congress won't nullify it, otherwise they would seem weak against terrorism. Also, any damage done by the wiretapping or his other executive order to stop federal funding for abortion, also known as the Mexico City policy, is already done before the next president can undo it. With these limited checks on executive orders, the president is pretty strong.
I believe I've been hired by the people to do my job, and that's to protect the people, and that's what I'm going to do.
President can also formally appoint cabinet members across the vast executive offices. This can help him adjust the policy of the different organizations that operate under the branch. Even though he is able to appoint many top figures, in comparison to the amount of employees that make some kind of decision or another, he barely scratches the surface of who he wants in offices. One of the non-written, informal powers that the president will also often use is the executive privilege. This power lets Bush or any other president keep conversation and advice secret from the legislative branch. This power draws its basis on the idea that in order for both branches to work smoothly, they must be able to operate independently in some regards. But the information hidden must follow the constitutional basis and must not break any laws. The most famous case of illegitimate privilege would be Nixon versus USA. But even Bush ran into some problems when he claimed executive privilege on April 1st, 2007, rejecting a subpoena against Karl Rove, one of his direct advisors. The subpoena was to have Rove testify in response to his decision to fire federal prosecutors. Bush issued the privilege and stated, "Mr. Rove, as an immediate presidential advisor, is immune from compelled congressional testimony about matters that arose during his tenure and that relate to his official duties in that capacity." Any checks on criminality didn't apply, and so Rove got away scot-free.
But still the law has to be followed, Mr. Rove. Exactly, it does. And look,
the president's other informal power in the position of chief executive is to impound the funds allotted by Congress. He just doesn't have to spend them. While the public's opinion of him might drop if he didn't spend money on a program that would help millions, there really are no checks against it. In this role, the president has checks, but ones that don't provide much practical defense against his initiative. President Bush chose to use his powers liberally, acting more imperial than not.